Welcome to On Target, a Eurasia Group Foundation production. I'm your host, Zuri Linetsky. I'm a research fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation. Today, I'm joined by Rachel Tecott, an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College in the Strategic and Operational Research Department. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And just before we get underway, I have to say that my views are my own, and they don't represent the War College, the Navy, or anything to do with the government.
Okay, that's now being recorded, so it's for the record. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your work, your research interests, and a little bit about you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. As you said, I'm an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College. I'm working on a book that focuses on U.S. efforts to build militaries in partner states, mostly efforts to build armies, but it doesn't necessarily need to be just about armies. More broadly, I research international security, military operations, campaign analysis, net assessment, war games, civil military relations, bureaucratic politics. And I'm from San Francisco, and now I live in Boston and make the trip to Newport, and it's much nicer in the summer months.
Yeah, wasn't it Mark Twain who said the coldest winter is the summer I spent in San Francisco?
Oh yeah, the coldest winter I ever spent was the summer in San Francisco. Yeah, that's why those little stands that sell sweatshirts do so well.
Okay, Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens is a man that we should all be proud of as Americans, I guess. Obviously, your research is actually you're prolific. You're fairly young in your career, and I've read so much of your writing. It's been in the Monkey Cage. You've been in Foreign Affairs. You have multiple peer-reviewed publications. So, I mean, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you. And I think the first and kind of most basic, if you will, question from the perspective of your research is, what is security sector assistance, or security cooperation, or security force assistance? Does it matter what we call it? Is there a preferred acronym?
Oh man, it depends who you talk to. So that's actually a much harder question that you might think, because what some people call security assistance, other people call security force assistance, other people call security sector reform. Everybody's got different names for similar things. Sometimes a term of art refers to the particular authority or pot of money that is funding a particular security assistance program. So just throw all that kind of terminology aside, and just most broadly, what we're talking about is efforts to increase the military capacity of partners. And so what that can look like is, it can be a whole bunch of different things. It might involve cash transfers, weapon sales. It often involves advisors on the ground trying to help local militaries reform their personnel policies, their training regimens. Sometimes it's just a small team of advisors working with one unit. Sometimes it's a huge effort to build a national military from the ground up. And so it varies entirely from case to case. But in general, in a nutshell, trying to improve the military effectiveness of a partner.
Okay, so we're improving military effectiveness. Is it just about the military and trigger pullers and the logistics that support the trigger pullers, or are we also talking about institutions? Are we also talking about creating, from the American perspective, for example, a joint chiefs of staff, or different ranks? So I think Jason Lyle has a newly well-received book, relatively newly, Divided Armies. Yeah. And I think we can get into the theoretical criticisms, but I like the book. I think Jason's a really smart guy, but I think what he talks about is, some of it talks about middle-ranking officers and kind of ethnic makeups and divisions within militaries. Is this part of it, or are we just talking about getting people to shoot straight using night vision goggles, or using a tank, or whatever we're doing in Ukraine, for example?
Some people might be talking just about trigger pulling and night vision goggles and that sort of thing. And some security assistance programs are just focused on that nitty-gritty tactical level stuff. But what I tend to focus on, and what I think most people think of when they think security assistance, is a much bigger, broader umbrella that includes a lot of what you were talking about. It includes the politics. It includes decision-making, institutions. So when the U.S. tried to build a military in Iraq, for instance, you're not just training, platoons how to shoot straight and fire discipline discipline, you're also trying to build a ministry of defense. You're trying to set up personnel policies, command structures, and everything top to bottom and bottom to top. And that's why it's such a difficult thing. So we might be about to get into this, but what makes security assistance hard is precisely what you raised just now, that it's not just about shooting straight. If it were, it would be a much easier task for US advisors that are sent to help train their partners to do that. I can pause for a second if you want to hold on that thought.
Well, I think it's well. First of all, thank you for the amazing segue. I think your book project is on bureaucratic pathologies and security force assistance, and so I think we should just immediately jump into that, because I really want to make a joke about Burkina Faso and Mali, because I know your colleague Jonathan Caverly has written a lot about international military education training and the relationship to coups, but that's a separate body of research that we won't touch on right now.
We can touch on that. I've got an article under review with another excellent scholar, Renana Miles Joyce, that's about the civil military relations on the partner side. So if we want to, we can put what do they call it? We can put a pin in that and come back to it if there's time.
It's appropriate because we're teaching people how to use grenades as well, so pins are pretty important. Grenades.
Yeah.
I can keep playing with these puns. I'm really sorry. So I guess the question then becomes, when thinking about security sector assistance and kind of governance, we're talking primarily, or at least in what I've read from you, this is primarily a DoD production. If I understand your writing correctly, and then at some point state fits in because there's a lot of different funding authorities, and then there's Title 22, and then
good luck trying to.
So there's this 333. Nick Turse just had something on 127E. Yeah. So can you make this simple, right? Go ahead.
It depends. So there are State Department run programs, there are DoD run programs. Over time, it has shifted a bit from State Department to the DoD in terms of the general weight, how much of the security assistance work is being done by state versus DoD. It's shifted towards DoD. There are still a lot of security assistance programs that are implemented by the State Department, owned by the State Department, and implemented by the State Department. There are also some that are farmed out to contractors. DHS gets into it. USAID gets into it. The two main players historically, State Department and DoD, and then over time, especially, starting in the 1980s, but then especially after 9/11, it really shifted mostly to DoD. But that's not to say that state doesn't still play a big role in a lot of cases. My focus has been on DoD implemented security assistance, so the big DoD projects in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's not just those. The U.S. Army just institutionalized security force assistance and the security force assistance brigades. So that's the Army's new institutional fix for this problem of building partner capacity. So the trend line continues to shift security assistance towards the DoD, but you certainly don't want to think that that's the only player involved in these efforts.
Okay. And so getting to your book project, maybe tell us about what your book project is about. And I think, as a sub question, although I shouldn't be asking you double-barreled questions, it's a bad research habit for anyone that's curious about research methods, only one question at a time. But your research has something to do with the idea of persuasion versus the idea of conditionality. So I feel like maybe we should talk about that.
Okay, sure. All right, let's see if I can do the elevator pitch on.
That's right. I haven't heard one of those in a while.
All right, here we go. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so the U.S. tries to build partner militaries in partner states, largely so that it can offload the burden of managing a local threat to a local partner. That's the idea behind it. That's the theory behind security assistance. There's a threat somewhere far away. The U.S. would prefer not to have to deal with that threat with its own troops. The idea is it's more economical to develop the capacity of local partner forces to manage that threat. Okay, so that's the goal. But it's really hard to do. So why is it hard to do? For the reasons that you raised in, I think, your first or second question, which is it's not just about trigger pulling. It's really about decision making. It's decisions that leaders make, that civilian leaders make, and that military leaders make, from the top, from a prime minister to ministers of defense, division commanders, brigade commanders, battalion commanders, all the way down. It's decision making that makes or breaks military effectiveness. So that's I'm pulling that from a big body of academic literature on military effectiveness. Steve Biddle, Caitlin Talmadge, a lot of there's just a lot of work that says, after a certain resource threshold is met, it's really about these patterns of decisions that make military effectiveness, that make or break it. Okay, so the problem with security assistance is the US tends to give the most assistance to the states who are led by leaders who have a whole lot of incentives besides building the most effective military. So, for instance, a lot of the recipients of US security assistance are worried about coups. And if you're really worried about a coup, you're going to take a lot of steps that are not really designed to optimize to increasing the ability of your military to fight. You're going to be worried about how do you make sure that no one in your military is able to unseat you in a coup. So you take a lot of steps that end up undermining the US goal of building
That's
more
a
effective
thing,
militaries.
right? So you could create ethnic militaries that are ethnically homogenous, that are
Mhm,
loyal to you. So this has actually happened
mhm,
at,
mhm.
for example, area I'm familiar with. Or you could, for example, promote based on patronage as opposed
Yeah,
to merit.
precisely. Yeah, and US flows of US security assistance are a really good source of funneling cash into patronage networks, so you can buy loyalty from groups of leaders. So that is why the fundamental challenge of security assistance in these kinds of states is actually influence over their decision making. That's the challenge. That's the central challenge of security assistance.
Okay.
And that is a really difficult challenge, and it's not one that the US military has historically been optimized to addressing. That's what diplomats are for, nonviolent, non-coercive influence. But here we are sending the DoD to go over and try to find ways to convince partner leaders to implement policies that might run counter to their interests, but would build their military effectiveness. And so that's where we get into this persuasion conditionality thing. So in the book, I talk about an influence escalation ladder. What I mean by that is we send US military advisors out to try to influence partner leaders to implement policies that improve their militaries. So first you start with kind of a teaching approach. Here's the process that would work best. Here's why I think that this is a better way to train, to shoot, whatever it is. And then you move to persuasion. So if the partner isn't really interested in implementing your advice, you argue, you try to explain the logic behind what you're saying. You build trust and rapport, and then you try to leverage that trust and rapport so that you can persuade them to follow your advice. Then one step up on the escalation ladder from there is incentives, or what people call conditionality. And what that really means is just instead of trying to change what the partner wants to do through persuasion, you say, okay, I know what the partner wants to do. I acknowledge that. I don't think I'm going to be able to change what motivates them. I'm going to accept what motivates them. And I'm going to say, you really rely on this funding for whatever it is. You rely on this ammo. You rely on this. You rely on that. Well, I'm going to condition that assistance on cooperation in a few important ways. So that's sort of, if persuasion fails, you can escalate to an incentives approach. And then
So
something the US doesn't like to do anymore, the last leg on the ladder, and then I'll turn it back to you, is
yeah.
actually taking direct command. So all of these forms of influence are indirect. You try to teach, persuade, incentivize, but then the fourth is, okay, I'm going to just take direct command of this partner military, and I'm going to implement the policies that I think are important myself. And that's not something the US military likes to do, but we did do it in Korea back in the 50s.
Okay. So it's a combination of carrots and sticks, good leadership ability, which is very hard. Leadership is incredibly hard to do, I think, in the best of situations. And it sounds like we're not doing security force assistance or security cooperation in the best of conditions. We're talking about states that, in the Korean case that you brought up, had just been at war or were at war. You're right about Vietnam, same thing. And then obviously Iraq and Afghanistan are more two recent cases of this, obviously coming out of war. So these are not ideal conditions to do a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this idea of conditionality is really interesting to me, because what you're talking about is, I want to incentivize someone positively and I want to incentivize them negatively. But my question then becomes, why don't we do it? Is it because we're worried about Russia? I mean, now we live in an era of great power competition. Russia's been growing its influence in, for example, Africa and the Middle East through
Yeah.
arms sales. There was just a piece in Foreign Affairs about how China might be doing some of this arms. I mean, you talk to people in Africa and China is selling them a lot,
Yeah.
growing amounts of weapons. So are we
Yeah.
worried about that? Is it some other exogenous factor? Or is it just us?
I think the first, yeah. So this is one. I think this is the fascinating question. It's why would you tie your hands behind your back and not use the leverage you have to incentivize cooperation? If you think it's an important objective and the partner's not helping you meet that objective, then why not use the tools you have? And so I'll come back to that and address your point about China and Russia. I think there's a lot of conflation of presence with influence. There's an assumption that wherever China is achieving influence over the partner, whereas maybe it's just bad investments that aren't going to turn up much for China. Same with Russia. Being present somewhere, sending advisors somewhere does not necessarily mean that US foreign policy objectives will be compromised. And I think that we should look to our own experience to realize that, and look, our presence in places has not equated, not directly led to cooperation from those partners. So why do we then assume that everywhere China or anywhere Russia goes, they're going to be able to get, cooperation from the partner at odds with US objectives? So although I actually do think that this concern is motivating some of the aversion to conditionality, I don't think it's necessarily a substantiated concern. So I like, yes, when you talk to the SFAC commander, they'll say, we see China there.
Back.
Oh, sorry, the Security Force Assistance Command. That's the command in charge of the new Security Force Assistance Brigades. And absolutely, you talk to people in the SFABs and they'll say, we don't like to use conditionality because we don't like to say no, because if we leave, in comes China or in comes Russia. And I think that is a really an uninterrogated set of assumptions baked into that. And I think the real answer to why we don't use leverage and use conditionality is actually much more boring. It's much more bureaucratic. I think conditionality is really difficult for bureaucracies to manage. It's really, really tricky to set up your advisory programs. It's really annoying and difficult to get everybody you want over there, to get them sustained, to get uniform, like just to do all of the things required to just get the SOPs, the standard operating procedures of advising in motion. The last thing you want to do is hit a pause button after you've set that all up. That's you're throwing a chink into your own kind of into your gears, and that's not fun for anybody to do. And it also reflects poorly on the tour. So you don't want to be the guy that has to hit pause and make no progress because you conditioned assistance and your threat didn't pay off and they said no, and then you had to go back and say, okay, we're going to cancel it. It's in no one's short-term interests to hit a pause button. It also has it creates risks of negative attention to the advisory programs. And this is something I've written about a fair amount. Basically, I think with a lot of US Army advising in particular, there's a big concern about drawing negative attention to the projects. This isn't really what the Army loves to do. No matter how much it says security force assistance is a core competency of the US Army, the Army prefers to fight. That is what it's all about. That's its organizational essence. And anything that distracts from that is something that it wants to sort of minimize headache with. The goal of the US Army in advising, I don't know if it's actually building stronger partner militaries so much as making sure there isn't too much bureaucratic headache associated with that job that it has grudgingly accepted but doesn't really like to do.
So this is as an aside, I did some work for DoD, and I think it's really important that we kind of caveat what we're talking about, not in terms of the content of what you're saying, but in terms of the process. So these programs that we're talking about, these security force assistance programs, they're authorized, they go from DSTA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. They're developed there. They're developed with the combatant, actually at the combatant commands. They're initiated within the countries with the Security Cooperation Officer, the SCO. Then it goes up to the combatant command. Then it goes to DSCA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. Then it goes to Congress where it gets authorized. And it might be the case that the tranche of military equipment, whether it's night vision goggles or Cessna 208s, which are planes that we use for casualty evacuation, or if they're mud boats for Niger, or if they're machine guns or armored personnel carriers, they have to be authorized by Congress and by the Defense Department. And what's really interesting, and I think what could get lost really easily, is that there's a lag. So I might be the person on the ground in, let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan who's saying, we need to get this item here now. It's not like Ukraine, where Biden can authorize something and it goes there immediately. In most cases, it's actually a 1 to 2 year time lag from when you hit the process, start the process, to when things arrive. And it could be that there's another person in that position, in that country, who's actually executing this package. So there's any number of hiccups in this train. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't mean to tell you your business, because you're the expert.
No, it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. I hope we can talk more offline, once we wrap this conversation. But yeah, I mean, I think it worked really differently in Iraq, because of the coalition command structure. There's MNFI, Multinational Force Iraq, and then Minsticky was the sub-command under MNFI that was responsible for building the Iraqi army. And I think a lot of the processes that you're talking about that are kind of associated with standard peacetime security assistance, where it wasn't the same process in Iraq.
Okay.
And in Iraq, I'd say MNFI commander is king. And Minsticky commander is sort of, second king, but the MNFI commanders, George Casey, David Petraeus, Odierno, Austin, they were really the deciders when it came to the U.S. security assistance effort in Iraq. And even if they weren't nominally on paper the final decider for something like the upper limit and what the U.S. was providing, there was so much deference in Washington, especially from the White House to Congress. There was a lot of oversight of the effort to build an Iraqi army and an Afghan national army by Congress, especially by the opposite party of each administration. The flip there, but overall, it was really this was MNFI and Minsticky's show in Iraq, and all the other actors that you might think might be involved in some way. Yeah, but they weren't deciders. So the process worked quite differently.
So we actually have discovered another potential pathology, which is you have peacetime or traditional security cooperation, and you have quote unquote wartime security cooperation, which is more a la minute, a la carte ordering, if you will.
It's just deference to the commanders in theater.
Okay.
It's
Understood.
just I'd say it's not so much a la carte as it is just there's a guy on the ground, and that guy on the ground is the king, and we'll decide how this process works and what gets done. And that is a whole nother thing. Like the U.S. side civil military relations of security assistance, both in wartime and in peacetime, are their own book.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And this raises a really interesting question, which is, are we putting, when you think about conditionality versus persuasion, you're talking about systems and people. And you talk about, your answer to why we don't do conditionality is that it creates a lot more places for a chain to break, like a bicycle chain to break. But my question is, are we not, it sounds like we're putting a lot of confidence and onus on a personality, on an individual.
Yeah.
In a really fluid and dynamic situation. Is that maybe this is not the right question to ask. Is that a smart or efficient thing to do?
Yeah.
Maybe let me rephrase. Is that an effective way to run what could amount to a multi-billion-dollar arming effort?
I don't think so. So there's so much discussion in the security assistance, whatever you want to call it, world about, the personalities of the advisors and just what are the attributes necessary for an advisor to be effective in their job. But I think the starting problem is the way that we measure an effectiveness of an advisor tends to be how well do they get along with their counterpart? How well do they build trust effectively? Do they build rapport effectively? Do they maintain that trust and rapport and that line of communication to their counterparts? And if the goal were rapport, then that would make a lot of sense. But if the goal is to, influence the counterparts to implement policies that improve military effectiveness, then rapport is not the way that you should be measuring effectiveness. And so the ability of an advisor to build rapport is not what you should be putting all of your stock in. And I think that is a very big problem in the way that the U.S. Army, at least trains advisors, there's a lot of, if only we get the right caliber, the right kind of person,
Right.
then it'll all be good. We got to, the big problem is that we can't incentivize the best to do it because that's not the pathway to promotion. But if we could only incentivize the best to do it, then, then they'd be able to do it. But that, it assumes that rapport is the means to effective influence. And I think that that sets up advisors for failure. Or for goal displacement, where the advisors, will conduct a tour and say, I have such good friends over there now, I did a great job.
So this, I was once loosely considered a social scientist. You are currently a social scientist. It sounds like when you talk about trust and rapport, you're introducing a lot of what we call measurement error, or you're introducing a lot of concepts that are incredibly difficult to measure against any type of objective performance metric, right? So I know, and go ahead.
I actually don't think so. I actually think it's the easiest thing for them to measure. Like, I think it's actually quite easy for the Army to say, they invite us back, and that means we're effective as advisors.
We have access.
Yeah, we have access, therefore we have succeeded. And I think in some cases, the goal might be access. The goal might be intelligence, and the intelligence you get from access. If the goal's influence, you can't assume access gets you influence. If the goal is military effectiveness, you can't assume that access and rapport get partner leaders to make decisions that run counter to their interests to build a more effective military. They might like you a lot. You might effectively build rapport, and that might not get you what you're after. I just think we need to keep our eye on the ball for what is the goal.
I see. Okay. I understand. So we're in contrast to what I was saying, we're actually almost measuring the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, we're measuring low hanging fruit, and low hanging fruit that it makes sense for the Army to incentivize its advisors to optimize to. It's a bureaucratically advantageous goal to tell advisors to go for because of all those bureaucratic kind of complications that we talked about in the beginning.
So this might be a hard question to answer then, but if we're not measuring the right thing, is it possible that not measuring the right thing, or measuring the easiest thing, is leading us down the path of creating militaries that, in the Afghan case, fold really quickly, or in the Iraq case that we've had to rebuild twice? Why is it that we succeed? For example, Korea's, I think, an example of success. Vietnam is definitely not an example of success.
You'll find people who fight you on even on that one.
Well, yeah, there is actually, to be fair, there are a lot of people who would say the big army actually succeeded quite well. Now, that's an in the weeds. I think that's an in the weeds, if you will.
I mean, it just, you have to get to what is the U.S. trying to achieve, and did the U.S. achieve what it wanted? And obviously not. If you're measuring, did the military improve in some absolute, against what? Improvement is not the goal. It's what's the threat that the U.S. is building the military to combat, and was that threat effectively combated? And that's the goal of assistance.
So why is it that, why did Afghanistan turn out, the military, why did the Afghan military turn out to be weak, if you will, or not cohesive? And why have we been relatively more successful in Iraq, although I think that's a contentious debate in and of itself? And why is it that we were successful in Korea?
When you say successful in Iraq, are you thinking about just the Iraqi special forces?
Well, I mean, that's all I have to rest my hat on, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think when you think about the Iraqi military at the largest level, it's not a success.
Right.
But when you hear about the reporting, particularly coming out of Mosul towards the collapse of ISIS in Iraq, you're hearing about these amazing cohesive bodies, the Tiger Brigades, that are really just, kicking ass and taking names.
Yeah.
So we have
what explains success, failure, and security assistance. So just zooming way out, I think where there's close interest alignment between the U.S. provider and its assistance recipient, you're going to do a lot better, because influence isn't actually it's not a limiting factor. If the partner is really strongly motivated, the wolf is at the door, the wolf is through the door in the Ukraine case, then you might not have to arm wrestle them to prioritize military effectiveness.
Okay.
So it doesn't always have to do with the US, it has a lot to do with the partner. The problem is those are the few and far between cases. Like those aren't the cases that we tend to provide the most assistance to. The vast majority of US security assistance cases are not to highly motivated partners. And so influence is almost always a problem. Okay, so within those cases where influence is almost always a problem, what explains success and failure? And I think that there's nothing's monocausal. Social scientists like to, there are true believers and this is the variable that matters, and I'm not at all one of them. So there's a lot going on within the recipient state that's going to condition how US security assistance goes. But I do think a very important ingredient for effective security assistance in places where there's a lot of motivation problems is incentives, and in some cases direct command. And this is very uncomfortable for Americans who like to think of ourselves as the anti-imperialist empire. We came of age in the wake of decolonization. We're out to help free people be free. How do you square that with taking command of a partner army? And that's what we did in Korea. We took command of a partner army. The US 8th Army built the KMAG, the Korean Military Advisory Group, which took command of the ROKA, the Iraq Army, and basically controlled their personnel policies, controlled their budget, controlled their training directly. And so that was, I think, an important factor for the transformation of the Republic of Korea Army. That's not necessarily something the U.S. wants to do. It might face an uncomfortable choice. Does it want to be, imperial in that way? And the answer might be no. And in that case, the U.S. has to really just calculate, how big of a U.S. interest is at stake in a particular case. And I won't get into that, but it's a grand strategy question of, how does the US, prioritize threats around the world? And if you're really unwilling to, use carrots and sticks to incentivize cooperation, how big of a threat could it possibly be? If it's actually a real threat to US interests, then wouldn't you incentivize cooperation? It would strike me as something you would want to do. So in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which I would code as fail cases, when we're talking about the national armies, and we can move to the special forces in a second, which I think we do differently. But the national armies, I think there were leaders who, for a lot of good reasons, a lot of understandable reasons, and a lot of bad reasons, had very little interest in prioritizing military effectiveness. And the US funneled in assistance and tried to teach and persuade and coax and cajole and rapport build. And none of that was going to get even close to incentivizing partner leaders to implement painful policies to improve their militaries. Just moving to the special forces, we do that pretty differently. And it's usually not big army, US big army that's doing that. It's usually, Green Berets, or it's some other constellation of characters on the US side. So I make an argument about the bureaucratic interests of the US Army. That doesn't necessarily apply to the interests of the special forces that are building partner special forces. So I see a lot more willingness to incentivize cooperation in special forces, and a lot more willingness to take direct command. And then I also think that the dirty secret of success in Iraq with special forces is you're not actually building them to operate independently. You're building them to plug into an American system of enablers in the indefinite and long run. And so if you plug a group of highly motivated, well-trained people into US, air support, medevac, intel, logistics, and everything that's really hard, then maybe that's a sustainable model for the future. I actually don't, cast aspersions on that approach. The goal, it might actually make a whole lot of sense to build small unit forces that plug into American enablers for the foreseeable future. It's a much less ambitious goal than building a wholesale army from the ground up, and maybe lowering your ambitions is a pretty good thing to do.
Well, I will say that I've had the privilege of interacting with some special forces people that work in Africa, which is a region of the world that I know best. And when you hear about special forces in Somalia, those people working with them will say they're really good at what they do. I got a chance to meet a special forces guy who was working at AFRICOM. We bonded over deadlifting, and he said that the Nigerian special forces are white hot, soft special operations forces. So there is a different dynamic. And it's interesting, though, that when you talk about special forces, it sounds like there's a little less concern over this imperiousness,
Mm-hmm.
you will, because the solution in the soft world, the special forces world, is to plug them into a structure.
Yeah, to plug them into a structure, and also to incentivize cooperation by by heavy vetting, like having a really rigorous process of figuring out who you're going to elevate, and you decide who you elevate. So unlike the Iraqi army, where we did not control who became division commanders at all, we did kind of control who became ISAF commanders. And so there was the Iraqi Special Operations Forces. The name has changed.
Yep.
Every new iteration of the ISAF Golden Brigades, counter, it changes 1,000 times. But it was a very different U.S. approach by different U.S. actors that have a very different organizational DNA than the big army. So, thinking about the evolution of the U.S. Army and the evolution of special forces, thinking back to Kennedy's Green Berets, that was part of them. There's certainly, a dualism in special forces. Are you the advisors or are you the James Bonds? But at least one of those identities is you're the advisors, and that's just absent in the Army. And I think that changes how the two organizations approach it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's an organizational culture component to this as well.
Yeah. I usually take issue with the word culture as like a very fuzzy thing. I think it often has to do with interests, and then interests shape ideology, and then ideology shapes behavior. I'm not sure. I'm never really sure like where ideology ends and culture begins, and where interest ends and culture begins. So I usually go with ideology, but
I think there's a whole separate conversation we need to have about research methods now as it pertains to security sector or security force assistance or whatever we want to call it. The last, I think, the last comment I have for you then is it'd be cool to see, one of the successes in the Western Hemisphere. We don't talk about the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine, if you will, is Colombia. Colombia has arguably is a good case. I know that's not the part of the world that you specialize in, but it's an interesting and curious case to me. It's something that, I think you cite this book, the Proxy War book, by Berman, the 2019 book. Talk about it a little bit, and it's just an open question. You feel free, we can pass over it, but I think it's an interesting case that people can think about.
Yeah. I agree. I don't know the case well, but I got to change that. It's a pretty interesting one. I haven't gotten into it to the same degree, largely because it seemed to me that the project was not the same. Like what we were trying to do in Colombia was not quite the same as that's always true in varying degrees. But I think you make a really good point. We got to look at the success cases and what was different there. So that's on my to-do list, is get to know the Colombia case a lot better.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I think it's really important that we pause here and say that the views that you've expressed here are yours and not the U.S. Naval War College's. I just in case we didn't get it on the first go around, I wanted to give you an opportunity to say that again.
Yes, yeah. That everything that I say is these are my own views and not the views of the Naval War College, the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the government.
Well, fantastic. Rachel, I got to tell you, I'm so thrilled that we're colleagues. I hope we get a chance to talk more about this. This has been a fascinating and exciting conversation for me. Thank you so very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.